Dobro. Hello. It's nice to see you all here on behalf of the postgraduate doctoral program in pre-modern history. I'm very happy and glad to welcome here colleagues from abroad within the project that's its entitled. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the project. Oh, okay. Clinical will tell everything that's connected to the factography of the project and all that is actually connected, related to today's round table that gathered us here all today. So once again, I'm happy to see you here. There are some doctoral students. This is, of course, we did our doctoral program, so this is a round table connected to our postgraduate doctoral program for modern history. And now I'm going to give the floor to Drinka Norsel, who acts here as a person in charge from now on, and then to our wonderful colleagues who will give us some new information now on how we should research early modern period Habsburg monarchy and new ideas. Thank you.
So, yes, good morning. Well, everyone, I would also like to thank our lecturers for coming here today and everyone for coming and attending, hopefully participating as well in this 6th scientific colloquium of the project European Origins of Modern Eurasia, Transfer of Ideas on Political and Cultural Fields in the 18th and 19th centuries. So today's colloquium is organized by its team member, Professor Teodora Šek-Bernardić, and today it will be held in the form of the round table, which is part of this program for the postgraduate doctoral study of pre-modern history at this Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Zagreb. I'm happy to greet the head of the doctoral program, Professor Gačan. It is worth saying that the previous colloquia held by the project team members encompassed a variety of topics in the field of transfers of knowledge, such as transfers of ideas within the field of law, political culture, and even medicine, more specifically, for instance, the field of pre-modern epidemiology and transfer of ideas in these fields. The topic of this colloquium or round table is what is new in the early modern history of the Habsburg monarchy. We will have the opportunity to hear 3 lectures and we'll have a later discussion for which you will, I'm sure, be enticed to participate in. I would like to introduce our first lecturer today, Professor Veronika Čapska, who is a senior researcher at the Department of Comenius Studies and Early Modern Intellectual History at the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. She's mentoring students at both graduate and doctoral levels as an associate professor at the Faculty of Humanities of the Charles University. She was a visiting fellow at the European University Institute in Florence and a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge Trinity Hall in the recent academic year of 2018-2019. In her work, she put special emphasis on interconnecting history with cultural anthropology and visual and literary studies. Through this interdisciplinary approach, she puts focus on transcultural phenomena in early modern history and deals with topics such as exchange and patronage relations, print culture, process of cultural transmission, and early modern textual practices, such as translations. Furthermore, religious nonconformity and piety and gender history. Her past research projects include, for example, the edition of the German diary kept by the Silesian noblewoman Gabriela Sobko of Kornice, and the edition of the book Process of Cultural Exchange in Central Europe, 1200 to 1800. Her lecture today will draw upon this research experience and point to textual practices such as translating and editing, along with their gender implications and issues with the recent re-evaluations of the historical notion of agency. So, please, the floor is yours.
Hosting me. It's a joy to be here, and it's always a joy to speak with doctoral students. So I'm particularly glad and pleased that this panel has a very fortunate structure, I would say, in the time it is organized in the time of demand for global histories. And I myself work with the concept of transcultural history, which I think might even be specifically in the context of the Central Europe, Habsburške Monarhije, synonymous to global history. I also try to provide some insights. And my strategy, how to tackle difficult or challenging themes, has always been to rethink or reconceptualize the tools we use as historians. So if certain tools seem not adequate, I think the best strategy is to really rethink, reconceptualize, redefine our analytical tools. So this will be quite a methodology-oriented presentation. And I have the two texts that I have kindly, Thea has kindly circulated and I have sent and shared with you are related to my habilitation book project. So the bigger book cover, the habilitation book project with the title Between Text and Textiles, the Schwarzkopf's family, textual practices and cultural exchange at the turn of the Baroque and Enlightenment. And in my presentation, I will follow the structure that was suggested to us and that I think is very useful. So I'll proceed from identifying the topic, choosing certain methods and concepts, and then analysis and conclusions. So basically, of course, there are always multiple factors at play when we identify and define our project, be it doctoral, postdoctoral, our research team. In my case, and I think I'm a part of the generation who very much wanted to move beyond the national frames of interpretation. And I always felt quite annoyed by national frames of interpretation, sort of trying to move beyond them. And I've also been interested in defining transcultural history. Basically studies that pay special attention to what we might call border-crossing phenomena, such as migration or various types of mobilities, including travel or translation. But of course, usually, typically, we need empirical sources. And my decision to focus on the family of Sporix and Schwarzkopfs was connected with quite a fortunate finding of an overlooked or underestimated corpus of sources that was specifically preserved and is preserved till today in the Tyrolean Regional Archives in Innsbruck. And that was for a long time of no interest to Czech scholars or Austrian scholars. I have found out that there's a collection of sources, a correspondence by Anna Katarina Schwarzkopf covering almost half her life from the time 1719 to 1754. And this was her correspondence with the nuns of the Benedictine Abbey in Sonnenburg, which is in South Tyrol, and no one has paid any attention to it. The father of Anna Katarina Swartzburg, Franz Anton Spohr, is a notorious person, we could say. Sometimes people consider him almost synonymous with the Bohemian Baroque culture. I think the name Messinas characterizes him very well. Messinas, patron of not only book printing but also sculpture and architecture and high arts. And there's, as it's usual, there's still quite a lot left. Sometimes I use the title Colombo's wife for the wife of Franz Anton Spohr, who existed, and sources exist, but no one has ever paid any attention to her. So my basically aim was to focus on that there was much more to Franz Anton Spohr and his family, and that the sources are richer than merely only high arts or patronage of high visual arts. And what I have been becoming impressed inspecting archival sources was the richness of textual activities or textual practices, as I say, that have been connected with the family and that I think are in many ways typical and characteristic for the 18th century. Also the joy with interaction with the rising body of texts, printed or unprinted, that were available. So since this was a habilitation project, in many ways these were side sources, side problems which emerged in the course of my PhD dissertation. So maybe a hint for you, there'll be a lot that you won't be able to elaborate on or maybe to pay your attention to, and it's, I think, advisable to save something for later stages of your work, major questions and also maybe empirical material. Yes, that's it. That's the collection of letters by Anna Katarina in the Tyrolean Land Archives in Innsbruck. And of course, the preserved body of sources was much richer. There's almost across Central European libraries, almost in every major library you would find printed books that are connected with the Spohr or the Swartzburg family. These tend to be translations, and so those are rich body of sources. But it was the finding of this correspondence that sort of convinced me that it's really worth to turning this into a second project. And I would say that I still, although I've been pursuing other interests, I still elaborate and keep in touch with it till today. If I would like to, let's see, let me get back. Here, yeah. Just this instead of this, that's fine. Yeah. So if I would like to characterize in a broad way what I deal with, and I would probably use the term transcultural histories of textuality, materiality, and agency. So this is the generation of the heirs of Franz Anton Spohr, and I think that one of the reasons why we can explore gendered textual practices is that he had no male heir, and his daughters, Maria Eleonora Spohr and Anna Katarina Spohr, received prime education. There's a void, I would say, or a gap. We don't know who taught them refined French. I presuppose they had a French governess, but there's no evidence for this stage of their learning. But the attention that their father, Franz Anton Spohr, paid to their education was related to the fact that he was a homo novus in the aristocratic circles. He was the son of a 30 Years' War general who was of a humble rural background, who was not noble. So although the Sporik and Schwarzburg family was one of the richest noble families in Bohemia, they were quite not accepted by the aristocracy. They were looked down, upon, and this motivated both Franz Anton Spohr and his heirs to really engage in various types of patronage and show that they have refined tastes for art and books, etc. So this was an important part of their self-representation and their search for being accepted and respected. So in my habilitation project, I inspected the textual practices connected with this generation of the heirs of Franz Anton Spohr. Regarding the choice of interpretative model for the study of what I have dubbed the search for milieu as a laboratory of textual practices, obviously transcultural historical approach was something that was of major interest to me, and relational, I could actually think that and say that transcultural history is part of relational approaches to history, and especially when I was looking at the translations, translated books translated by Anna Katarina and Maria Eleonora, I faced the situation which applies to the whole Habsburg Monarchy, the whole Central Europe, where to start when you want to research translations. And for a long time, research and translation was part of intellectual history, and it was rather a Cinderella topic to do research on translation. Peter Berg has largely changed this, and has fought for a very long time for accepting translation as an important topic and one of the characteristic topics of transcultural history. So when I looked at how to approach the research in translating, I embraced the model that was elaborated by Manuel Castells, the model of the space of flows. He approaches social space as a space of flows, and he also defines what flows are. And let me quote Manuel Castells. By flows, I understand purposeful, repetitive sequences of exchange and interaction between physically disjointed positions held by social actors in the economic, political, and symbolic structures of society. So at the core of this definition is exchange, which is a very cultural anthropological topic. Sometimes I joke with my colleague at the Charles University, who is a cultural anthropologist, that when we want to explain that gift exchange is a very broad topic, we just say exchange instead of gift or gift giving, and that it is one of the lenses through which cultural anthropologists see and analyze society. So I embrace the concept of the space of flows, and again, one of the texts that I shared with you actually compares the Schwarzburg patronage activities in translation with a Jesuit project of translation at the Charles University and with an exile pietist translation project in Halle an der Saale. And it sort of focuses on approaching the study of translation by looking at the translation centers or translation hubs, which I think is one of the way how to start to approach this sea of material of translated texts. The concept of textual practices is a concept that I have coined, drawing on especially Roger Chartier, and that's been now also used by other colleagues, by Radna Pavlíčková, for example, at Palacký University in Olomouc, or by Lenka Řezníková at the Czech Academy of Sciences. And the reason why I have chosen it is that I was not happy with the term literature, and I thought it was insufficient, because this way we miss so many textual studying and researching. So my research interest in translation directed me to pay attention to a much broader spectrum of what I call textual practices, such as letter writing, editing, book patronage, book exchange. But we could also have diary writing or book reading as textual practices. So in one of those texts I shared with you in my chapter on Maria Eleonora and Anna Katarina, I characterize these sisters as practitioners of the word. And again, it is about searching adequate formulations, because also I have noticed that recently there's been a Springer edition, one of the many volumes that probably cover various parts of Europe, with the title Czech Women Philosophers and Scientists. And they've added Maria Eleonora and Anna Katarina to the volume. But I think it's a part of the strategy that Springer just wants to have a volume for every country, which sort of reproduces the national history. And then they basically present people as as someone who they, I think, were not and did not identify. I think we cannot describe them as women philosophers or scientists. So I like to describe them as practitioners of the word, or versatile, enthusiastic, skilled practitioners of the word. They have special skills, they have special knowledge of French, translated books from French to German, but I would shy away to describe them as philosophers or as scientists. So this emphasis on textual practices obviously is related to the theory of practice as elaborated by Pierre Bourdieu, and Roger Chartier, as a major authority in 18th century studies, builds on Pierre Bourdieu, on his theory of practice. And he also builds on Roland Barthes, as we might maybe get there as well. But you may know the legendary book authored by Roger Chartier, his collection of essays, Cultural History, Between Practices and Representations. And I would say that both representations and practices, both terms, refer to certain skepticism to what used to be called reality. So I think it's a way to avoid this troubled term, reality, and Roger Chartier prefers to study culture through the lenses of practices and representations. I myself quite like to approach enlightenment as a set of socio-cultural practices that can entail the cultivation of epistolographic skills, but also the cultivation of religious emotions or amicable emotions and social ties. And I think we will hear more about the Enlightenment's in plural in the presentation by Teaše presentation. So I approach the Enlightenment as a set of socio-cultural practices, and in the case of the Czech and Swedish families, I think I could also say that I understand Enlightenment as an educational project directed towards those at the margins of society. So Franz Anton Spohl and his heirs were quite ambitious regarding disciplining their subjects, but also enabling them access to texts and to schools and to hospitals. I think that this approach can be particularly fruitful when we search for women's agency and also the agency of the lower class people and social actors. Yes, reconceptualizations of agency. As many of you know, agency is one of the central key categories of cultural anthropology. And I would agree with Roger Chartier and Peter Stellabras when they emphasize that the Western concepts of writing and forming literary canons have been shaped by the ideal of single-handed authorship and by the cult of originality, which also prevent us to see very many texts potentially very useful for historians. I would emphasize that many specialized and time-consuming textual practices, such as translating, proofreading, and editing, have been undervalued and marginalized, while they were also significantly gendered. Thus, a change in perspective and a shift of interest from the concept of literature towards textual production as a collaborative social and cultural practice enables us to see women in their roles of skilled practitioners of the word. So I see the concept of textual practices as a research tool to move away from the classical canonical literature and classical intellectual history, I would say. To return to this. So when I speak about collaborative practices and reconceptualizations of agency, I have found it very productive, very fruitful to obviously study translation, but also to study correspondence. I like to call correspondence a highly relational and reactive textual practice. Obviously, correspondence is a dialogue. One cannot be the author of correspondence, or if we see it as a social practice rather than a literary genre, we need a partner in dialogue. And of course, as we know, in the 18th century, letters are also very often read aloud, so they were listened to. And if we look at correspondence, again, I would call it a collaborative textual practice. So for a long time, translation was underestimated as something that lacked originality, and through translation, historical actors could restyle really a book or a text through adding a new foreword, through adding new images, and through also adding new chapters, etc., as was often the case beyond religious texts in the 18th century. And if we speak about agency in the early modern Europe, I could cite Anna Katarina, who specifically regarded her books as home preachers. So it was believed that books can prompt people, they can move them to certain behavior. And of course, agency was also ascribed to God. So we should not limit ourselves to agency of individual strong characters, individual strong historical actors, but maybe situated in between, if we think of exchange, in social ties, for example. Obviously, this is inspired also by Bruno Latour, and I would say that my approach has been, if we want to dismantle the splendor of big-name personalities, such as Franz Habsburg, but many others, I think it helps us to move towards basic analytical units, maybe more humble ones, such as textual practices or collaborative agency. Yeah, so this is a number of historical actors who engaged in the spoke and Schwarzburg translation projects or projects of textual agency. And beyond the Spock and Schwarzburg family proper, that would also be, of course, printers, but also one of my favorite characters, Cox Merchant. Anna Katarina exchanged not only letters, but also boxes of books and boxes of other gifts with Benedictine nuns in Sonnenbuch. And she used one of her subjects, a Hobbs merchant, to transport all those gifts that accompanied letters between northern Bohemia, their northern Bohemian estates, and South Tyrol and Sonnenbuch. I could also mention a hermit, an eremite, who was used over the summer months when hermits could, of course, could be mobile and spend time outside. So there were very many people who were engaged in this movement, circulation of text, but also in their production. And as I move to the conclusions, I would like to emphasize that I regard many of these concepts as transferable. I still build on them. I try them useful in many other smaller projects. And I think that we could say that canonical texts often obscure that collaborative character of textual production. And if I maybe could sum up this trajectory from identifying a research topic and selecting sources, selecting concepts, and putting them to work, I think this example of letters is a very good example. So we have archival resources, and then we employ the cultural anthropological gift exchange lens, which I think that would not really occur to very many people when they would see that collection of sources, and that guides us to explore cultural transfers. So as I said, the letters of Anna Katerina document some 30 years of a steady contact and of an exchange, large-scale exchange, not only of letters, but also of boxes of books that Anna Katerina let to be published under her patronage. And she would send sometimes 200 books, sometimes 50, sometimes 100. And she also sent gifts of money to individual nuns with whom she wanted to be in touch. But she also received a lot in return, particularly very luxurious embroideries and textiles, which were, I would call, Rococo embroideries. It was a Sonnenberg style of working with textiles, which was characterized by adding enamel details and adding beads to textiles, which made it more practical in terms of resisting tear and wear. And this long-term exchange also was related to not only to spreading religious literature, but also to spreading certain types of religious cults. So Anna Katerina would send images of a newly canonized John Nepomuk to promote his cult, and sent those graphic images to South Tyrol. She would receive from the nuns, for example, one of my favorite examples that I like to refer to is a statue of little baby Jesus that was donated to her by the nuns, and it was probably related to the fact that she was about to give birth to one of her children, and she wanted to have that statue with a story. So my hypothesis is that it was a Salzburger infant Jesus, and she wanted to have a book that would tell the story of that statue, of that infant baby Jesus. And she also arranged a new decorated box for the statue and placed it at her own home altar. So we could even speak about social life of things as they move across by a long distance across Europe. But as I say, for a long time, I think the letters would be regarded as writings of some sort of insignificant letters written by women without employing the lens of the gift exchange that actually calibrates it, I would say, in an analytical way and allows us to achieve interdisciplinary interpretations. So as I conclude, I would like to emphasize that some textual practices which require education, skills, and which are very time-consuming, such as translating or editing, can very easily be overlooked if we uncritically accept the Western ideal and emphasis on single-hand authorship. So my aim is to show that it can be beneficial to look beyond individual authors as creators of entirely new original works and direct attention to collaborative projects, cultural transmissions, plurality of hands and agencies, because this perspective is also more inclusive and more gender sensitive. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this lecture. I'm sure that we have been brainstorming into a new field of research, new approaches to research of the modern cultural history, particularly of Habsburg monarchy. And now I would like to welcome Professor Singleton. Okay. Professor Jonathan Singleton is a lecturer at the University of Innsbruck, where he teaches global and comparative histories of Central Europe from the early modern era to the 19th century. His interest for the rich culture and history of the Habsburg Empire first led him to partake in an exchange semester at the University of Vienna in 2011-2012. He specialized in the transatlantic attributes of Habsburg history during a master's degree in American history at the University of Edinburgh. His thesis there was entitled A Story of Benign Neglect, Relations Between America and Austria from 1776 to 78. As a PhD candidate, he continued his research on the related historical issues, also at the University of Edinburgh, where he successfully defended his doctoral dissertation in 2018, which was entitled Empires on the Edge, the Habsburg Monarchy and the American Revolution 1776-89. He was awarded several scholarships which provided him the opportunity to conduct research on both sides of the Atlantic. Since completing his PhD, he has been a short-term fellow at the Hagley Research Library in Wilmington, Delaware, and a Richard Plaschka Fellow at the Institute for Habsburg Studies, where he expanded his research for his first book, The American Revolution and the Habsburg Monarchy 1763 to 1795, which was published in 2021. So in June 2019, he joined the project Changing Social Presentations of Political Order around 1800, year 1800. Governmental Concepts in the Correspondence of Maria Carolina Naples-Cecil at the University of Innsbruck. In his lecture, he will touch upon the questions of the proper global setting for the history of the Habsburg Empire, particularly in the light of the fact that the narratives on this empire remained fragmented and on the margin of interest, despite the Habsburg monarchy's rich global entanglement in global history.
Thanks very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning. And thank you to whoever prepared the very fine British weather for me during this time as well. If it's okay, I'll sit here at the front so that I don't block the screen, although I'm not that tall. So only Veronica, I have to jump to see you there. But I hope you can all hear me, see me, and it's more important that you hear my words anyway. First of all, I'd just like to begin with a confession. So I found this opportunity both fantastic in some sense, but also quite challenging in another sense, to come to you and to discuss something that is really, for me, a work in progress, and I'm very much at the beginning of that. So the usual excuses and caveats apply, but the reason I chose to do this topic rather than something that I've done already is to kind of think through with you some of the possibilities and the options for Habsburg history generally from what I think is going to be rather important and very promising perspectives. I hope that becomes clear as I begin. So with that aside, I'll just jump right into it. Habsburg history remains ripe for further studies along global lines. But what does it mean to do global history from the perspective of the Habsburg Empire? To integrate a region too often aligned in the worldwide vision of imperial powers, of transnational encounters, and of course cultural currents? What sources can be deemed suitable for such historical endeavours, and what norms can be challenged from the insertion of one of Europe's great ruling dynasties into the narratives of overseas lands and commercial competition the world over? These are the questions I'm currently grappling with in my efforts to reconceptualise Habsburg history from a wider, more international and ultimately more fitting perspective. In the course of today's presentation, I will consider how we might answer such questions based upon relevant sources and methodologies. And whilst I still remain sceptical about the benefits of global history in general, I do want to demonstrate the applicability of similar methodologies as well, and the historical lenses which I think hold a lot of promise for future research that are necessary if we are to achieve a fully global vision of the Habsburg lands. It is for this reason that I've included the word towards in the title of my talk today, to signify how we might approach global history, first through other methodologies and examples. My reason for this should then be clear, that currently we still have so much more to do in the overseas exploits of the Habsburg lands and their subjects, and the reverberations that these exploits held for the Habsburg dynasty at large. Before we may truly advance a global history then, we must first understand the full reach of Habsburg history itself. And it is for this reason that I've been teaching aspects of global history, as you kindly pointed out, in Innsbruck over the last few years. And teaching these courses have demonstrated to me, and hopefully my students, the wide variety of Habsburg history beyond the usual standard narratives. And to be sure, Habsburg history casts many long shadows across the road in places that we won't expect. Brazil, for example, not only owes its 200th anniversary of independence this year to an Austrian archduchess, but also the green and gold national colours emblazoned on their flag, and such as the gold t-shirts of the football team you see pictured here, result from the mixturing of the green house of Braganza, the Portuguese dynasty, with the gold from the gold and black of the house Habsburg. So the next time Brazil play, you can support them as former Habsburg subjects. The European obsession with the potato started with its successful cultivation of one particular species by an Austrian monk in the early 16th century, whereas addicts of cocaine only have to blame the scientists on board the SMS Novara, who circumnavigated the world in the 1850s and 60s and brought back specimens of the coca plant responsible for the production of cocaine today. And on a lighter note, we can also thank a Bohemian artist whose new methods of painting first produced the anatomically correct images of kangaroos and koala bears in Australia, which allowed zoologists to identify the marsupial family and more. And so whenever you see those signs in Vienna saying there are no kangaroos in Austria, you can prove them wrong. The Habsburg contribution then to the world can go on and on and on. And as exciting and exotic as these examples seem to be, we must always remember their utility. Global history is not about discovering odd connections, but rather about setting those connections within a context and charting the repercussions of these connections across the world. As the doyen of global history, Sebastian Conrad artfully distilled it, the global historical perspective allows us first and foremost to move beyond nation-state history, something that Veronica pointed out, and I'm sure everybody would agree here, and equally to also overcome Eurocentric views of the past. As an approach, it is a way to ask different questions and to see not only how Europe interacted with the world, but also to see how the world interacted with Europe. Let me make that clear then with two short examples. When the Persian Shah, Nasir al-Din, visited Vienna to witness the World's Fair in 1873, he came not only to bolster his prestige as a non-European ruler, as part of the European-wide Shah mania, as David Mottadel has called it, but also to utilise his personal links with Europe for the improvement of his country. During his time in Vienna, he lobbied officials for support in training the Persian army in order to fend off increasingly British and Russian aggression in Central Asia. The Shah's plan met with success when the Austro-Hungarian military officers travelled in 1879 to Tehran to advise on modernising administration practices and to eventually train over 6,000 elite Western Persian-style troops. You can see the Shah of Iran with the Archduke at the exhibition on the image on the left, and then on the right you can see one of the Austrian advisors with his new Persian cadets. The Austrian military mission, to give it its official name, founded by the officers in Tehran, became one of the most prestigious academies in Asia and continued training cadets following Austro-Hungarian guidelines well into the 20th century. In this image you can see it's from 1900. Both King Kalahua of Hawaii and King Chulalongkorn of Siam, nowadays Thailand, achieved similar results in recruiting Austro-Hungarian advisors for their own governments. And as a second example, two Maori teenagers travelled back on the Novara ship to eventually reach Vienna, where they were welcomed personally by the Emperor Franz Joseph before they returned to their homeland in New Zealand. They brought with them a printing press that allowed the Maori to escape the increasing British oppression by establishing their own language printing press, and the first Maori language printing press, leading to several important publications, in a sense to capture and help rescue their culture. And you can see this, this is beautifully documented in a book by Helen Hogan, an Australian historian, about these two Maori teenagers. They're pictured as they were older in life, and then you can see one of the contemporary images of a Maori in Vienna at that time. So such examples demonstrate then how the Habsburg world could impact the world at large and in the other direction, by the world coming to Central Europe as well. Finally, I see great hope for global histories of the Habsburg monarchy, given the inspiring words of Patrick O'Brien, who in 2006 wrote that global history as an approach allows us to, quote, construct negotiable meta-narratives as an impulse for scholarship to become more cosmopolitan in outlook and meet the needs of our globalizing world. Whereas other historical fields have embraced the profits of global history already, Habsburg history still sadly remains far behind, with its head buried in sand. Global narratives of Habsburg dynasty and its lands in Central Europe tend to obscure and overlook the rich bi-directional connections such as these between the Habsburg monarchy and the rest of the world. In spite of a richly entwined global past, such facets of Habsburg history have remained generally siloed and distinct from one another, and as a result are sequestered away from the master narratives of the Habsburg monarchy. Today there is no single account of the Habsburg lands from a global perspective. Peter Judson's extraordinary achievement, The Habsburgs, A New History, and I do not want to do this book down in any way, it's a brilliant, brilliant book, but it is sure a book that is written from a rather limited geographical gaze, which is solely fixed upon Central Europe. And more recently, Martin Radi's The Habsburgs, which has appeared simultaneously under the subtitles To Rule the World, I think in the American edition, and The Rise and Fall of a World Power in the European edition, has made not one mention of the Austrian Habsburg connections to the wider world, and instead focuses only on the world when it comes to the Spanish part of the dynasty. So this is a general problem, I think, is that we don't have this sense of, say, these connections, although they exist in these master narratives. We only have them in very specialized small articles and small essays and so on like this. And so reading such works then leaves us with the conclusion that after the irreparable split of the dynastic branches under Charles V and the loss of the Spanish inheritance under his namesake Charles VI, no Austrian Habsburg connection with the wider world existed. And this, I think, is quite a beautiful allegory of Charles V separating the world, as you can see, between Ferdinand, his one son, and Philip II of Spain, his future successor. And you can see the whole world is sort of represented here, the Atlantic, the Americas, Asia, and so on. And this, I think, is also a good symptomatic picture of our current situation, to see this as that's the moment when Spain goes off and becomes that global empire, and the Austrian rump is left in Central Europe, just within Central Europe. Such a viewpoint, I believe, belongs firmly in the rubbish bin of history, but we need new interpretive models and outlooks, just as Judson's books have consigned older tropes and older views of the Habsburgs as the sick man of Europe to the rubbish bin of history too. In recent years, I believe we are coming closer to such a viewpoint. A shift towards the global appears gradually over the horizon, building from a more positive narrative of the Habsburg historical condition and upon generations of very good scholarship on specific facets of global interactions, what I meant by the essays and smaller works on these topics. So we have good work, for example, on commodity flows, and I'm thinking here of the fantastic work by Veronica Hieden-Hanschow, as well as Anne-Marie Jordan-Verschwendt and Klaus Weber, as well as trading relations. Daniele Andriozzi, Clemens Kaps, Michael Wanner and Karl Stanich, to name just a few, who have explored Central Europe and its condition within the globalization of European economies. And Habsburg's attempts at colonialism, a reoccurring theme, a very important theme, have appeared forgotten within the public mindset. This is particularly the case I found in Innsbruck when I was teaching my students, that none of them had a sense that Austria attempted to be a colonial empire. But these colonial attempts have received rather significant scholarly attention. And I'm thinking here of Leopold Auer, as well as Hauptmann de Schmet, Kottler, Leidl, Meisler, and of course Walter Sauer, who has really led a lot of that work. There's also a good understanding of particular examples, such as the Ostend Company and the role of Ostend within this colonial attempt. And of course we have many good Belgian scholars who have looked into this, Frederick de Hont, Jan Parmentier, and Michael Serraus, to name just a few. And then also in the case of Trieste with Claudio Deli and Mario Stock. Absorbing this information then is key to reinterpreting our wider frameworks. And certain individuals responsible for tying the Habsburg lands with the wider world have enjoyed various scholarly treatments, from the would-be colonisers to rulers such as Charles VI, whose Iberian dream, Charles VI, remember, was the king of Spain that lost that title during this war of Spanish succession and became the emperor of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Austrian leader, in a sense. So it's really at that point with Charles VI that, again, there's this understanding of a split in historiography and in general. But we're aware now of how the Spanish dream still percolated beyond Charles VI and increased, and I'm thinking of the works of Agustí Alcubero, Carlos Cornelius and Peter Gasser, as well as William O'Reilly in this regard. All these studies then, and again I realise there's a lot of names to throw at you and I'm happy to send a list of them, but all of these studies have helped so far to create insights into the global condition and connections of the Habsburg lands. And I would also say that there is an increasing output in this, and there's sort of these works that are in progress and coming out. This one, for example, by Michael Falzer, Habsburgs Going Global, the Austro-Hungarian Concession in Tianjin, China, in 1901 to 1917, is a fantastic new book that has just appeared in the last few weeks, and there will be a presentation on it next month in Vienna. There's also a book by Alison Frank Johnson at Harvard called The Invisible Empire, which was meant to come out in February this year, and I'm not sure when that will appear, but it should appear anytime soon. So I know there are a few other scholars working on such works. And I myself also editing a collection of essays on global Habsburg history. And so it's for this reason also that I include histories in the title, not just the word history, so it's in the plural histories rather than singular history, because I think there are many works that will approach this from many different viewpoints, and many different scholars will be involved in this. In many ways, global history is still a collaborative practice and should remain so. But beyond this existing literature then, there remains many desiderata. We need empirical studies on crucial periods such as the 1680s and 1690s, as well as the 1740s and 1770s, and 1815 to 1850, as well as considerations for how colonialism, or global imperialism, function beyond the direct seizure of land and the transportation of global goods. The reappraisal of the oceanic element within Habsburg history needs to go beyond the standard accounts of shipbuilding, naval forces, and consular relations. I'm thinking of Rudolf Agenstir, Barschritter, Meyer, and Sondhaus, for example. And intellectual connections from worldly dynasticism to applied scientific discoveries require modern interpretation, reflecting, for example, upon recent lessons in the ideas of circulation. And more importantly, historians of extra-European places, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Mexico, and the American West, need to become cognizant of the Central European contributions to those places and to integrate the Habsburg dynamic within their own narratives. So it's also about collaboration and outreach with scholars of other backgrounds, nationalities, and so on. Foremost of all, a general synthesis of such works would help to shape and apply more concretely the global lens of the Habsburg lands, helping to forever erode the notion of the Habsburg monarchy as a landlocked or European hinterland that still prevails largely in the public and scholarly mindset. Completing this task will secure then a brighter future for Habsburg history and Habsburg scholarship, and will allow us to rediscover the reality for many Habsburg subjects. For centuries, the exchange of goods and ideas flowed between Habsburg territories and foreign lands on a global level. Across the ages, Habsburg subjects participated in the colonization of the Americas, the exploration of Asia, the subjugation of Africa, and the investigation of the natural world from the mountains of Tibet to the depths of the Mediterranean, and from the North Pole to the lush Amazon rainforest. The Habsburg dynasty itself accounted for among almost all of the royal houses of Europe, and counted among its members two imperial rulers in the Americas, the Empress of Brazil and the Emperor of Mexico, as well as protector of the Holy Land and a claim to the Western Hemisphere. And they also supported missions, both scientific and religious, across the surface of the earth. The Habsburg monarchy habituated foreigners from across the globe within its imperial nexus, such as Spanish courtiers who abetted the emulation of Western commercial powers, and travellers with distant tales who regaled rulers and ruled alike, and artists of all kinds who interpreted the road for Habsburg view. But let me now turn to a few concrete examples from my own work and how we might plug them into a wider global approach to Habsburg history. And for these examples, I've decided to choose those which most closely align to the theme of this colloquium and your overall project. And I take a few examples which until recently I also thought would be disconnected themes, but in view of global history I realised that they become more and more connected with each other as historical phenomena. In the first instance, the Catholic Society of Jesus, otherwise known as the Jesuits, had become crucial for the spread of Christianity to the peoples in the New World in the Far East throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Habsburg subjects formed a core community within its order, raising from only 250 Jesuits in the 1550s to nearly 2,000 by 1750. This is just counting the Austrian and Bohemian ones. As such, Habsburg subjects were prominent missionaries abroad and became not just soul savers, but also explorers in their own right. In northern Mexico, for example, Eusebius Kino, a Tyrolean, discovered the mouth of the Rio Grande River and was the first to map the Baja California region, effectively disproving the European theory that California was an island, in addition to his own missionary work among the Arizona and Sonoran peoples. For these Central Europeans, the Jesuit order offered the promise of discovering the world, especially in the Americas where emigration to the Spanish Empire had been outlawed for non-Spaniards. Many of them, of course, returned following the expulsion of the order between 1759 and 1782. Some of them, of course, died en route or were imprisoned in Spain on their way. But some of them survived and then went into quiet hiding in the Habsburg lands, such as Bernhard Haberstedt in Vienna, Franz Xaver Weigel in Klagenfurt, and Florian Pauker in the Cistercian Abbey at Svetel. All of them had been active in the Americas. One particular, I find one particularly fascinating case is that of Martin Dorbitzhofer, who hid in rather plain sight as a confessor to Maria Theresa, following his forced exile from his mission in Paraguay, South America. Like many of his exiled brethren, Dorbitzhofer shared his experiences through all the written mediums. Pauker, for instance, sketched many of the scenes from memory at Svetel. This you see on the illustration here on the left. In Vienna, Maria Theresa often called on Dorbitzhofer, not just for confession, but also to hear about his own personal stories from South America. And eventually he grew tired of her fascination, as well as the court's general curiosity about his experience, so that he published a book in 1783 detailing every aspect of his South American life and insights into the Paraguayan people. I think it is worth reading out the preface to the German edition, where he explained his reasons for publishing the book, and this I quote from him. In America, I was often interrogated respecting Europe. In Austria, on my return to it, after an absence of almost 18 years, I have been frequently asked questions about America. To relieve others from the trouble of inquiring, and myself from answering inquiries, and at the advice of some person of distinction, Maria Theresa, I have applied my own mind to this little history. Dorbitzhofer's book became widely popular, receiving translations. Again, I think it's a nice point that you made about the importance of studying these translations, into 7 European languages, and it sold thousands and thousands of copies. His work did much then to rehabilitate the order in the wake of the expulsions, but more importantly, it did a great service to bring light to the subjects of his mission, the Abioni people of Paraguay. Dorbitzhofer's example reflects a phenomenon of great importance in the Habsburg entanglements with the world, namely the transfer of knowledge between world regions. There are countless examples within my own work and the themes and topics I've explored in my teaching. Between 1750 and 1850, Austria launched at least 5 major scientific expeditions to North America, the Caribbean, South America, including Venezuela and Brazil, as well as Southern Africa. All of these destinations yielded incredible transfer of knowledge, not only in terms of ideas, but also in terms of materials, in the form of botanic specimens for domestic research, resulting in an explosion of new scientific studies. From the Caribbean expedition of the 1760s, the expedition leader, Nicholas Jacquin, published alone over 10 volumes, and these are very thick volumes, of works lasting up until the 1790s. And from one of the American expeditions came not just flora and fauna, but also written reports to Freemasonry groups in the Habsburg lands, which focused on the economical, geological, societal, and cultural aspects of American life. And in my own book, I dealt with a similar example from the 1,500 handwritten pages of the first Austrian representative in the Americas, Baron Frederick Eugene de Bailly-Berthoff, whose reports on the economic life of the young United States to the Viennese government reached even factory owners in the Austrian Netherlands and places like Styria. Finding and tracing these original documents, which came from broad and informed contemporary Habsburg subjects about conditions outside of Europe, is one important step. but to step back and see them for the bigger picture that they are is also another. In this I am helped by the idea of the circulation of knowledge. This circulation can take different forms. There is the literal circulation of knowledge from an external place, in other words, the swirling of ideas among a community, such as the readers of these reports, but also circulation as a historical concept derives from the post-colonial emphasis on the co-production of knowledge between interlocked systems, and here I'm thinking of Kako among many others. Proponents of circulation argue that knowledge is always produced in interaction, and there is no such thing as pristine or pure knowledge lodged in one single place of origin, and instead interaction is the chief site of knowledge making. The examples mentioned just now, the testimonies by missionaries, the specimens from scientists, and even bureaucratic diplomatic reports, demonstrate this co-production of knowledge in heaps. When we re-examine these sources, we see how Dorpitshofer, for example, was not just relied upon his own experience amongst the Albioni people and learning their ways of life, but he was also relied upon other works by Jesuit missionaries to fill in his memory blanks when writing his books 18 years after the expulsion. In the same way, the efforts to examine and categorize the bounty of botanical sources and products from the missions to America and Southern Africa depended upon local knowledge of plants. So often these explorers hired bushmen and guides and so on like this and asked local natives for what plants they use for medicinal purposes and so on, or their help in finding new plants and so on like this. And this then combined with the influential system of the Swedish botanist Charles Linné to produce new scientific works. And finally, Balin Berthoff, that Austrian representative in Philadelphia, would have been nothing without his contacts within the American Congress and, in the case of his numerous profiles of Native American nations, without his visits to Native American leaders and delegations in New York, which allowed him to detail more accurate reports on their economic conditions. All of these instances, then, can come together to reveal the ways in which Habsburg knowledge about the world grew out of a combination and new combinations of knowledge production in an increasingly networked world, from the Jesuit order and its network to the diplomatic service and its network to the Republic of Letters and their network. In a final example, I'd like to turn to a research project that I began earlier this year. This new research agenda relates to the Deporting Society, an Austro-Hungarian state-sponsored religious organization which was established to support Catholicism in the United States. And over the course of 70 years, from 1829 to 1914, the Deporting Society raised donations from across all of the Habsburg lands, culminating in over $4.5 million gulden worth, which in today's money would equate to several $100 million, perhaps as much as $500 million in real purchasing value. These donations went to American parishes in the Midwest, primarily to serve German-speaking Catholics, and over 500 churches were built in North America with the funds from this society. But money also went towards the church's efforts to convert Native Americans to Catholicism, a recurring theme. Roughly 300 priests travelled from Central Europe to the United States, founding institutions which still exist to this day. And dozens of them became church leaders within time. Several archbishops, 24 bishops, cardinals, as well as 2 saints. What does this society have to do then with the circulation of knowledge? Well, for the duration of the society's existence, members gathered together information on the spiritual condition of the United States, compiling these into reports that were centrally edited in Vienna and known as the reports of the Deporting Society, that totaled over 85 extant volumes. Many of these reports became the basis for ethnographic studies, and the society members were among the first transcribed Native American languages from the communities that they tried to convert. Such was the case with the Ojibwa language, first codified by the venerable priest Friedrich Baraga from Slovenia. His work is still a standard reference for linguists of the Algonquin languages today. But apart from this continued Habsburg transmutation of Native American understandings, I'm also curious about how this religious organization fits into a wider picture of imperial and colonial aspiration. I should explain that throughout its existence, the Habsburg monarchy has been a wannabe colonial power that rarely got the chance to solidify a colonial space. The settlement in Tianjin, mentioned in that book earlier, became the longest continual colonial site of the Austrian Habsburg dynasty after the short-lived factories in western Bengal in the early 18th century. Yet as a site of imperial power projection, the Catholic mission near Khartoum in the Sudan offered a base of soft diplomacy at a time when mineral rights in the southern Nile region were becoming increasingly prized by European nations. And and in spite of no formal colony within the region, the presence under the guise of a religious organisation, the Marienverein, allowed Habsburg officials an outpost from where they could gather intelligence and act according to their own priorities in the region. In the late 19th century, it was businessmen who acted as the government's frontmen, projecting interests in areas of political, economic or symbolic importance, such as claiming nickel deposits on the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, or the plan to take control of the equally mineral-rich region of the Sultanate of North Borneo, which the Austrian consul in Hong Kong managed to acquire for a personal fee. In the early 19th century, however, it was the church that played the role of the businessman, brokering contacts and exerting influence through the control of knowledge and funds. In this sense, the Deporting Society functioned as at an imperial level in the American Midwest, and an area of increasing manufacturing and resource intensity during a period when Austro-American diplomatic relations had all but collapsed following the crackdowns on the 1848 revolutions in Central Europe. In this regard, I see the Deporting Society as a means for the Austrian Habsburgs to achieve imperial power projection outside of Europe. This is certainly how contemporary American observers thought of it. You see this evidently in the cartoon above. It as an extension of papal authority that undermined American sovereignty and democracy. In this way, we can view the society as an instrument of the state. It was another case among many many colonialisms without colonies, to adapt the phrase traditionally applied to Swiss historiography, and which is mentioned in the excellent new volume by Markéta Kitzhofer, which is part of the reading list. Applying this lens allows us then to widen our gaze towards other instances of similar action, not just in the Habsburg case, but also within other national contexts. Colonialism without colonies supposes that a nation lacking formal colonial territory could still participate within the coloniality of modern empires, either through indirect influence or by adding to the discourse of colonial regimes. In North America, the Deporting Society and its members cast a huge political sway over the populace through the church and recognized the power that they held. Although the society was not established to colonize per se, members certainly spoke about their role in America in terms echoing colonial ventures elsewhere, and here I quote one of them. Without wishing to penetrate the future, it is certain that the plan is gigantic and of great importance, to bring the whole nation, which inhabits this immense country of the United States, into the bosom of the Catholic Church. Whatever may be the future condition of this people, whether they will retain their republican institutions or choose a monarchy, and though their civil institutions may oppose more or less hindrances to the spread of establishment of religion, it is certain that this population which moves forward with gigantic strides presents a rich field for the spread of the Holy Gospel. In other words, we should also borrow then from neighbouring historiographies in order to try and make sense of Central European connections with the wider world, in that case colonialism without colonies. And moreover, these current thoughts have also led me to rethink other examples across space and time, noting the similarities between the business ventures of the late 19th century in terms of the informal colonialism and the earlier circulatory effects of religious networks and actors. If one thing is for certain that I've learned personally, it is that we must always keep the broadest views in mind in terms of historiographies, methods, periods and sources. We must read widely and keep our curiosity active. Within my own works on the American Revolution and the Austrian Atlantic, which hopefully have not all bored you to death, I have done my best to fulfill this aim by using almost 50 archives in 18 countries in the first case, and in the second case by bringing together multiple strands and examples from different national historiographies, such as Belgium, Spain and Austria. Key to all of this then is also language learning. Acquiring French and German and other languages later on unlocked for me so much, and being able to access different modes of thought, different historical perspectives within difficult academic